of these to assess what the substantive decision making is in the mediation throughout the mediation, right? Every 5 minutes. Cookie.
I'm just a little confused. So why is B not in the quadrant below?
Oh, because you're right. That's good. So that's good. Okay. So B. So to say this better would be so the mediator starts asking questions about the broader context of party B. I didn't say that correctly. Thank you. That would be up there. If I said it, if it was the way.
So B didn't bring it up. I mean, it's the mediator.
Yes, the mediator influence on how broad that problem definition would be. Good clarification. Okay. So this gives us a sense of how we can now assess the substantive decision making. Procedural decision making. Let's look at an issue here. Are we going to caucus? All right. So now our continuum, our placeholders are all. It's going to be all caucus. Everything's in separate session, or it's going to be absolutely no caucus. Right. So now it's who's making that decision. Is it one of the parties? Is it the mediator? And we just have to plot that out. We can talk about it in the mediation. We can talk about it as their expectations for the mediation. Okay. And the CCR model, where would this be? Whose influence is it? All mediator. And on what? In the middle? Yeah.
But if a party requests the caucus,
If you're 5 minutes into the mediation and the party says, you know, this is not going anywhere and I want to go to caucus, what would you do as a mediator?
I think it would depend on what's going on, how ritual it is. Maybe it would be advantageous to talk with them individually.
Okay. What types of situations in the CCR model are we pretty comfortable with you going with the party's request to go to caucus? When a party requests to go to caucus, I think normally in the CCR model we say, you know, give me a couple more minutes, I need to get some broader context. We try to stay in that joint session. That's what people struggle with when they're first learning this model, right? I just want to run the caucus. But there are certain situations where I think, yes, we absolutely would go to caucus when they first request. And that's if they're threatening to leave. There's just some other issue that's on the table that it's clear, you know, we have to address this before we can move on. So maybe what the grid would look differently. It would just look different for each of those situations. Again, another benefit of this grid is that you can look at in a different time scenario, different time continuum. Okay, let's look at. So then the meta-procedural. So this is again where you're looking at how are we going to decide who makes decisions about caucus, okay, or what other procedural choices. So how are you? Who's going to influence that? Okay. So we've got 4 different ways that people have expectations. One person thinks that the mediator is going to decide who's going to be making the decision, and it's going to be the parties. Okay, you see that on B? Okay. D thinks the parties are going to decide who's going to do it, but it could be either one who ultimately makes the decision that they're going to go to caucus. But that's the party's decision that it could be either one. Right? A says the parties are going to decide that it's up to the mediator when it goes to caucus. Okay. Where does CCR fall on this one? Mediator decides that who's going to make the decision. So we're over here somewhere, and because we've talked about, there might be situations where we might allow the party to do that, but it's still the mediator. I would still say that we're on this line. It's always the mediator's choice. Who's going to make that ultimate decision of who's going to go, when we're going to go to caucus. So the mediator influences that it's going to be the mediator who decides if the party can make that choice or the mediator. Okay? That one's a little weird. All right. So with this new grid, in no way is it supposed to try to promote a particular approach. In fact, I think he really tries to remove the different approaches from this system analysis. What he's trying to is just awareness, that we are making decisions at every moment in a mediation, before it even starts and as it continues all the way to the end, right? And if we can really look at the entirety of that, then we can be much more reflective practitioners. This allows us to focus on the procedure and the meta procedure that the other one just did not talk about, and that we don't often discuss when we look at decision-making in mediation. And then it gives us this broader understanding and enhances our understanding of mediation, what is it we're doing, and what the field looks like right now. Stephanie and I have had a number of experienced mediators come to the center and say, you know, I've been mediating for 10 years, I just moved to Chicago, I would like to mediate a CCR. And we say, well, great, you gotta go to our 40-hour training and give us, you know, X amount of dollars. And they're like, are you kidding me? I have like 10 years of experience mediating, why wouldn't you want me? It's like, well, because you need to know our model. So some people, you know, we say, you know, why don't you come in and we'll do a simulation with you, we'll see where you're at. Stephanie, how often is anybody certified doing that?
Very rare.
Very rare. Is anybody ever certified?
It's taken a lot of resources. In those
Okay.
cases where we've made an exception, it's been almost like putting them through the training because we've ended up putting in so many resources to get them.
Yeah, so ultimately that might be there, but it's through training. So nobody comes in who's been meeting for 10 years outside of CCR and then gets certified. Yeah.
Totally off the subject, but just out of curiosity, what do you normally see them doing that we don't do?
Well, okay, so first point is that they call themselves facilitated mediators, even community facilitated mediators, but they have a very narrow focus. So I think the first grid almost helps us analyze what's going on, and it's just that it's a more narrow focus than what we do. But I think there's also that sense of self-determination, who has influence on the process, and I think that for other facilitated mediators, they allow the parties to have much more influence on the process, so when to caucus, and a lot more influence on what that problem definition is. That one is obviously huge. Because when they focus it on just the court issues, the mediator doesn't push them or ask them to explore much larger issues, broader issues. They would be open to it. So when you look at this, or if we have the grid up, the meta procedural, is that they think it would be okay to talk about that. They would like to. They've all been trained in this needs and interest theory, you know, interest-based negotiation. But once the parties define it that narrowly, they go with that. All right, so let's get into it. Let's look at the different models and where CCR fits. Did anybody do the self-assessment and want to share where they ended up? Probably didn't have a lot of time to do it. Jamie, did you get it done?
I got halfway.
Halfway through? Okay. For some of the law students who've been studying all the different procedures, where do you guys think you would fit in the first model, or the first grid, just the facilitative, evaluative? Which one do you prefer?
I think it might depend on where I am. Like in Daily Center, I have
Uh-huh.
probably going to be probably pretty facilitative, but a little more narrow.
Because you don't have time to get into those other
I mean,
issues.
you can try, but I mean, yeah, it's almost counterproductive on some level.
Right. Other people want to share? Anybody ever find themselves, or in talking about this, maybe they're more narrow than what they thought originally, or that you are broad, you can fit right into facilitator broad? I mean, I would say most CCR mediators do. I don't think this was.
Well, I would say also, like with the short model, both the definition is narrowed and I find myself, I'm not evaluating anything, but I'm probably steering a little bit more, like what questions or what options I ask questions about or things like that.
So in our model, when we talk about the difference between the adaptive model and our long model, the directive versus elicitive allows us to really assess. We're not evaluating, we know that. But when we've only got a half hour, it might be a little more direct on where we're headed. Okay, so while it seems, we feel like we're right here, really maybe we're up here somewhere, right?
Is it, I don't do the court cases, but would you call it more narrow too, because of the time?
Yeah. I mean, could we say that we might even be in the directive narrow? I mean, I don't know, for those who feel very passionate about what CCR's model does, is that problematic for anybody? Do you think that with this new system, we might be in the opposite quadrant?
I find it sort of refreshing that we can be flexible in that way, because at the data center, you've got to work with what's there, and so, in a way, I feel like that's a piece of evidence toward where CCR can be almost, it almost is kind of broad sense sort of aligned with self-determination. It's not of the parties, but of like the context, I guess.
So being able to adapt the process that is here into the context of what we're facing, the daily center. And so with our skills, we're able to move to other quadrants to meet the needs of an environment. Maybe not the parties, but the environment.
I'm wondering why time is not a factor in the new old grid and the old grid. In other words, at a certain point in time, you might be directed now. In the same mediation, there are times when you're going to try to be elicited thought. And those especially, I think, happen in court mediations where you go in trying to be elicited thought, and then somebody gives an opening statement that's like going on 10 or 15 minutes, and you need to go into directed narrow. So-
Well, I think you could look at this and make it provide that type of analysis. And so I start out here and I move there, or when I'm at CCR, I'm doing a long model, I'm here, but when I'm at the daily center, I go there. But the grid itself is meant to do a one-dimensional assessment, right? One time, that's it. Whereas the other grid, let's actually just go in and do those. The other grids, they're set up so that you can't say you're one or the other throughout the entire mediation, because they're set up to be at least 3 different kinds, right? Meta, procedural, substantive. But within there, you're supposed to talk about each sub-issue within that grid. Let's go ahead and let's go to that new grid and see where we fall. Let's start out with the meta procedural. You see where I tried to erase this? I don't know what happened. I'm new with the overhead thing. I don't really like it, but it's the way to do it. So, this is the meta procedural. This is meta procedural. So, who influences who's going to make decisions about procedure in the mediation? The mediator. Okay. So the mediator decides who's going to ultimately make decisions about the mediation. So we're here. And then when the mediator has that influence, what are they deciding? Is it going to be up to the mediator or up to the party? Mostly the mediator. Procedure, yeah. So I'm going to put timeline. Okay. So at one point, this is where we're at on the grid. Okay. So then we get into the mediation. So now we've decided, well, it's all backwards. Okay, so now we're into the mediation. Now we need to talk about procedural decision making. No more meta, okay? It's procedural decision making. So the question is, we've decided it's going to be up to the mediator, okay? Who's going to make those decisions about the process? But now, when we talk about attendance and participation, is it still the mediator? Who makes that decision? Like, who's in attendance? Who do we decide who comes to mediation? Yeah, the parties, right? Do we turn people away? There are some programs that say non-primary participants or just non-party attorney, they can't come in. That's just a policy. Stephanie?
I was gonna say, it's interesting because CCR itself influences a lot of this.
Case manager.
Because case managers do a lot of, help you, they don't ultimately say yes or no, you can't bring that person, but if they show up with 7 people, the case manager's gonna sit there and help them figure out who really needs to be in the room.
Mm-hmm.
So it is influenced on the CCR level.
No, it's good, yeah. That's actually maybe a problem with the grid, because Riskin talks about in the article how for a lot of programs, the program administrator or even the statutes or whatever is the overlying principle, or policy, I'm sorry, of the mediation, will set up some of these procedural decisions. And so the decision-making is not even in the hands of the mediator or the party.
So where would you put?
But in terms of the party, the experience is probably the same as if the mediator is.
And so even if it's the program, it's still not the party. Okay, good. Okay, so we'll say it's mediator or the program. But so for party participants, we still think it's the party who's attending. It's still the party who's making that decision, right? They bring somebody, if they want a support person, they want an attorney in the room. That's their decision, right?
Depends.
Depends. How come?
But are you looking at just who they bring, or are you looking at the parties themselves, whether or not they're there?
As for what's the context of when a party would be there?
Well, for example, at the Daily Center, they generally don't have a choice whether or not they're going into the mediation.
Ah, okay. Yeah, no, not, this wouldn't be about the referral to mediation, or if they're ordered, if it's mandatory or voluntary, but who's actually just in the room. But that's another good point, is that sometimes there is no choice, even if they, I see what you're saying. So we can't really even say it's the party influence, because maybe it's the judge. Right? If we had to put it down, in general, I think we're saying it's the party influence on this, right? And then we give them pretty high leeway about who they're gonna bring. What'd you say? Maybe the court and the mediator has some, is that accurate? It's hard to guess.
In a case here, if the party didn't want to come and said, I'm just gonna send my lawyer, would you take the case? That's right, so then the party doesn't get to decide that.
Okay, so, I still think we're talking about necessarily, the party and the lawyer are still like the same person, in this. I think.
Even if they're, but that's the party deciding who's gonna come and represent him, and he said, I want this person to represent me and I don't wanna be there,
Okay,
that's taken away.
okay.
I mean,
A rare situation, maybe,
It's a rare.
but let's put it up, so let's do something like this. So it's still, the party is getting decided, it's over there, it's still on this side. Okay. So then let's talk about, now we're in the mediation. And who decides, what the mediation stages are gonna be? Who influences that? What are the stages of the process? Yeah, I mean, if a party comes in, has anybody done a long model at IDHR? Which is a good example. And have you ever had an attorney who comes in and doesn't want to follow your process? Yeah. But no, no. I'm going to tell them this is the process they will follow. Yeah, people are used to different, not coming back to crosstalk too. You know, they're used to just staying in the caucuses. But your CCR mediator, you bring them back, this is very important, right? So that's a high mediator influence. So that's, sorry. Because I had to make a third mark.
I'm sorry.
Okay. All right, and then,
Then I'd make probably the exception about the Daily Center sometimes, but.
and the exception,
Well, like I've certainly been in mediations where maybe one party is certain they want to be in there, so like the whole thing is sort of standing up, and I don't get a chance to give my opening statement, or meanwhile, they're giving their initial statements. We never go caucus process, that's that model, but, on some level, I'm trying to work to control the process, but I'm not saying, putting down a rule like this is what the process is going to be. I'm really trying to go with the flow, to get a sense of whether they really want to walk out or not. And in the end, it might look like, no mediation there, but for a lot of the opening stages.
it may not actually follow
Right.
in this manner.
I'm more willing to go with their flow if they're about to walk out.
Okay. All right. Other comments about what the process is gonna look like? Maybe we need to move that one down. Just by their attitude, they influence the process.
well, they're on their way out, like they're sort of standing up, what am I doing here? You know, this doesn't need to be mediated. And it just ends up being a conversation as they're on their way, kind of out their way out of the room, but still talking at the same time. And I end up getting, in parts, my opening statement and eventually all of it, but we end up just in terms of trying to discuss whether he wants to stay in the room, getting through a lot of the first
The other
couple
stages. Do you then skip them if that information has come up, or do you?
Yeah, I probably skip them because by that time, it's probably 20 minutes gone.
So then the time constraint also, which is not an element necessarily on here, when the model itself doesn't allow you to do that. But that would be, I guess, the mediator, the program. Well, let's move 3 a little bit down.
Wouldn't they almost be aligned if this one with caucus, no caucus, and different part?
Okay, well, let's talk about the long model, because that's what we
Driving that
aspire
way.
to be able to do, right?
Still a mediator influence.
Okay, so mediator influence on this, and we decide it's gonna be in the middle, is what you said, right? When we were talking about
You're saying,
before.
I mean,
So it'd be like here,
well, I'm terrible at graph stuff, but I can't.
Okay.
Versus.
You're doing really good with it. You got that first.
okay, so we're saying that who's making the decision about whether there's gonna be a caucus and how much caucus, right? And so we're saying that in the CCR model, we decide there's going to be some caucus, and it's not all, it's not no, but that is the mediator's decision. But there are times when somebody threatens to leave or something that, when they request it, we might ask it, but it's still, it's the mediator's decision, right? So like there,
I would
Joe?
move it closer to, just a little bit closer to no progress, because in my experience, more time is spent cross-talk,
Uh-huh.
caucus.
so like there,
You know, you say that, but if you check in with the parties, like in caucus or in crosstalk, you say, you know, is there anything else that you want to add? I mean, really, they're kind of controlling it to some extent.
well, are they controlling whether or not you go to caucus, or are they controlling what you're talking about in those stages?
I thought you were mentioning like the timing and stuff like that.
When do you go to caucus?
That's, okay, that's good. So you're saying you may be ready to go to caucus, but you always give them a chance or to leave caucus, right? And
Right.
you're asking for more information, so timing of caucus. So, all right, so let's say this is whether or not we caucus, okay? Now let's do the timing of caucus. Who determines the timing of caucus?
I have a question.
Sure.
So we're saying that in all cases you do some caucus, not most of the time is spent in caucus, right?
Right. Right, this, well, no, this is, there are some models, so what we were just talking about, there are some models where everything is done in separate session. Absolutely everything. They're never together. And there are some models, mainly taught by Gary Friedman, you never caucus. The parties never separate. Right? And we're saying in the CCR model, we're not at either extreme, right? But we spend most of the time in joint session, so we're closer to never caucusing. And the person who makes that decision is the mediator. So the mediator is influencing that decision.
Except that it seems like if you were to read that as in all cases you caucus, in the
Mhm.
long model, even though we say I may want to meet with you individually, we almost always do, so it seems like it would move it on the other side.
Is this a percentage of time in a given mediation that you're in caucus, or is it a percentage of the time in mediations that you
Okay,
spend
so
some time?
let's say the first one is the percentage of time that you go to caucus, okay? And now let's do, or the percentage of time you're in caucus. And now let's do the percentage of time you go to caucus. So, and if you do 10 mediations, here, we'll explain that again. If you do 10 mediations, how many times will you caucus? 10 times. So that would be all caucus, is what you're saying. So at that point, we're saying that the mediator always decides to caucus in every mediation.
So it's almost like you need to say, in the other interpretation, you really wouldn't say all caucus, you'd say shuttle mediation or something.
Yeah.
If you want to be clearer about it.
Right, so point 4 is saying, in a given mediation, how much time do you spend in caucus? and all caucus would be shuttle, and no caucus would be the Gary Friedman level. Point 5 is, if you did 10 mediations in a row, how many times would you caucus? Okay. Is anybody surprised at, so far, how much the mediator is now influencing what we're doing in the mediation? Not surprised?
I mean, part of our training is
Yeah.
the mediator controls the process.
Yeah,
Sort of 100%.
okay. Great.
Process would be mine.
Yeah, I think it fits exactly what we say we do. Mediator controls the process, parties control the outcome. So now let's go into substantive decision making, and let's talk about who defines the problem definition. Sorry. Yeah. Okay, that's approximately. Okay, so as you're approaching mediation, when you're in the mediation, who defines what that problem definition is going to be? If it's narrow or broad?
Mediator.
Kind of both. Who's over here? Kind of both?
I think initially, you asked them to make their opening statement, so they initially define how broad or narrow the problem is, and then you ask further questions.
Okay, so, and like, if we went through, if we started doing a time continuum on this, at time 1, the parties are deciding what the problem definition is, right? Is that what we're saying? So in initial statements. And do they usually provide you with a narrow or broad? It does, yeah. So I'm just gonna put, we're on 6, but then, or maybe over here, we don't know. It depends on the party.
But then when we identify the issues after they've given their statements, then we can certainly broaden.
So then, later on in the mediation time 2, we're saying that now we influence what the problem definition is, and where do we want that problem definition to be? Broad. Okay, so 6 times 2. Okay, just to show at different points in the mediation, we're allowing people to have different amounts of influence. So early on, right, we're asking them, what brought you here today? And if they're gonna define it as narrow or broad, fine, we're leaving it up to them to make that definition. We're not asking them for, let's say, a case evaluation, right? We don't phrase it that way, which would mean we are saying that it needs to be narrow, right? We're not asking them to, we're not asking for any specific information. We ask that very broad question. What brought you here today? Right? Which gives them all the power to define what that problem is, okay? But right, once we set the agenda, by setting the agenda in broad, neutral, concise terms, we are consciously saying we want the problem definition to be broad.
I don't know that I wouldn't view it quite that way. What I would say is that you're inviting the parties to construe the problem or the issue as a broad issue. But I don't know that it's proper to say the mediator is sort of forcing the issue to be broad, because I've had parties where I've expressly said, you know, we can treat this as this broad problem, you know, with this set of issues, or we can talk about it narrowly. And the parties have said, you know, we really don't want to get into this because that's just a whole ball of wax that we don't want to get into right now. And I said, fine. So when you're saying we define the problem broad, I would view it as just inviting them to maybe themselves.
So when you set the agenda, you try to construe it broadly, but then you leave it up to them whether or not they want to see it broadly or narrowly.
Yeah, because I think if you force them to discuss a broad issue that they don't want to discuss, so when you guys were 5 years old, you had this, they really don't want to talk about it. It just, for me, it seems to be
Other reactions to that,
What?
Stanley?
I've had similar sentiments expressed by the parties, but I will often still ask them permission to talk about other things, because I can, maybe I've evaluated that there are some underlying issues that are bigger in some sense.
If you get resistance, we push down.
Sometimes, especially in caucus.
So
Maybe
when
not
you get that
Maybe not in
resistance,
broad crosstalk, because they might be
not willing to open up, but in caucus I'll push.
So it's a timing issue for you when you're gonna influence the problem definition, but ultimately in the mediation, you will try to define it as broad. So maybe in caucus, ultimately you get to some of those things. Steph, what were you gonna?
I was just gonna say that oftentimes we're trying to get them to talk, they wanna talk very narrow, but through our open-ended questions, we're constantly trying to get them to, even if it's not in a very directive way, but saying, well, tell me about your neighborhood. Well, I don't see what that has to do with this. Well, I'm just trying to gain, it helps me to gain a larger, greater picture